It's a blue moon day, and we're going to find out more about that later. But right now we're going to be talking with Jane Curtis about this mysterious disappearance of one of our greatest women aviators, Amelia Earhart. Jane?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's talk about the blue moon for just a moment first and
Sure.
get that out of our way. Incidentally, sky and stars and so on, she must have seen just beautifully from her night flights.
Yes.
So she was into some of that. Every so often there comes a month where there are 2 full moons, and this happens to have been one.
Right.
It happens every, I guess, 2.5 years or something like that. And they say that the moon looks different at that time. I took a look at it last night. 6:41 a.m. was a technical full moon moment. And I don't know whether they meant that or the coming 6:40. I think they meant the one that's already passed. But I looked at it last night at any rate, and in my imagination, the little, the gray areas on the moon that you see, the valleys and things, it looked sort of more bluish to me.
Really?
But what it's caused by is things in the air, of course.
Right.
And just depending on how much is there. Last night was very damp, very humid, and that was another aspect. So it looked really weird because some of the water vapor around it, there was a lot more of it.
Oh,
So it was bright, and then when it got higher, of course. But that's really all it is, that there were 4 full moons in every so often where there should be only 3 in a time period. And somebody started calling the 3rd one the blue moon. So nobody really seems to know why. But I did look it up, and I didn't find any clear scientific explanation.
But that's where our expression, once in a blue moon.
But that's where it comes from.
Right.
And strangely enough, they didn't start doing it till fairly recently.
Really?
I don't know if that's when that popular song came out.
Oh,
Blue
Blue
Moon.
Moon.
So maybe that was back in the 20s or 30s, whenever it was. But that leaves us a clear field for Amelia Earhart.
it does.
I don't think her personal data have ever been really publicized very much, but she was an awfully nice and interesting person. She came from Kansas. She had a sister with whom she was close, and she and the sister did all kinds of adventurous things when they were children. They were, I guess, upper middle class, good parents and grandparents. Their father, unfortunately, was an alcoholic. He was a lawyer, and he worked for the Rock Island Railroad, so they lived in a couple of different places at different times. But it was basically a good family life. When she got to high school, she went to high school in Chicago, and I could look it up. I guess the family must have been there temporarily or something. But she chose her own high school.
Oh.
And she was interested in medicine, and she was interested in science. So she went to high school there, and then she was in the middle of her first term in college. And she was born in 1897. So you see, at this point, World War I is just getting underway. It's 1914 or 15, then after the New Year. But her sister was in Toronto for some purpose or other working, and she went up there to spend Christmas vacation with her. And there she encountered a lot of wounded soldiers from World War I, aviators and otherwise. And she instantly felt such a pity for it and their plight that she took the Red Cross training, became a nurse's aide, spent the rest of the war. She didn't go back to school. She spent the rest of the war up there nursing these soldiers. And she did get slightly interested in aviation because she knew one of the pilots, and he actually took her to the field one time when they were going to be flying. She didn't get to fly, of course, but so she got a little seed may have been planted at that point.
Sounds like it.
But after the war, her parents separated and then later sort of halfway returned. But they were out in California, so she went out there and joined them. And her father took her as a treat, took her to an air show nearby. And they did have they probably had a big old Jenny or something, but they, for $5, $10, whatever it was, you got a few minutes up in the air. And he treated her to this airplane ride, and she was gone.
That was it.
Gone. That was it. That flying, she just had to do it. And they looked around and they found a woman named Anita Snook was big in the aviation world out there at the moment, and agreed to teach her free because they didn't have a lot of money. And she did, and so that's how she really began to get going on it. She went back east, and she did have a term at Columbia in pre-med. And she was, I guess, kind of leaning in the medical direction, but she was taking flying lessons at the same time whenever she could get away and scrape the money together. She went up to Boston, continued these lessons, and she was working in a settlement house up there, teaching English. And then, here, of course, here we are in the 30s, and it's beginning to be an interesting air scene. All kinds of meets and competitions and demonstrations and so on. And she got into that. And then Lindbergh in 1927 made the headlines. So she won a number of meets. She said she was also into helicopters, which they called autogyros. And she set the world record at the time for going up in a helicopter. And I've forgotten what the exact figure was, but it was high. I don't think you and I might want to be up there, in the cold and without any extra oxygen.
Right.
But she made a name for herself that way. And she founded a group called the 99s of women pilots. And she got along with them all. They were fine. She was no prima donna or anything. And she was not the best pilot of the bunch. And she knew that. And so it was just fine. Somewhere along the line, she had met George Putnam. People are always curious about George, or GP. But George was a publisher and a sort of go-getter for ways to attract the public interest and make money, make a living that way. Amelia herself, in 1932, flew across the Atlantic solo. She was the first woman to do that. She had been across it in an airplane because they had some sort of publicity stunt where they got 4 pilots to accompany the pilot who was flying it across the Atlantic from here to Europe in the easterly direction. But she didn't get to fly that. Her name came before the public again. And then, of course, when she went across on her own, landed in a pasture in Ireland, the world just went wild all over. She got into fashion designing slightly. She didn't own her own company or anything, but she designed really some chic things, in terms of the 1930s fashions. Their architecture and their clothing tended to be these lines and kind of modernistic looking, what we call. So she, at this point, was making a kind of hand-to-mouth living with these prizes she'd win, but very happy, loved flying. This picture of her, perhaps we have a picture amongst our pictures of, there she is. You can see that a little more clearly. There's another picture of her where she's looking up this way. You can see she's just thrilled to pieces. She just adored it. So she decided, she and Putnam kept putting her up to these they weren't stunts really. They were just competitions and firsts and all that to make money, to go on. And she, the first aircraft she owned was some little. It was to aircraft the way a roadster was to a car. It was called an airster. But she later had an old beat-up Vega, an early version of this airplane. And it was so beat up you had to practically coax it into flying. You see, it's a relatively compact little plane. And she managed to coax it all the way from the East Coast across to the West Coast, to Lockheed, who builds them. And they were so impressed, A, that she'd gotten it across the country, practically with chewing gum and wire and so on.
Wire.
And made it, yes. And B, that she was a woman, and C, that she was a pilot all days. So she had this good aircraft, and she was doing better things in it. The first of their big attention getters was her nonstop flight to Hawaii from the West Coast. Nobody had gone to Honolulu. And she did that. From there, she flew as a first to Mexico City, where she was feted up and down.
Yes.
And then she did another first across the Gulf of Mexico to, I guess it was New York, somewhere in one of the big cities on the East Coast. And one doesn't realize until one looks at the map that the Gulf of Mexico was a lot of water. And she went across there all on her own, entirely on her own, and loving every minute of it. And fortunately, the plane kept working. You know, in those days, you couldn't always rely on it. So that was those were her biggest stunts to date. Well, then, GP in the meantime was a middle-aged man. His marriage had not been doing too well. And a lot of people say, oh, she was a home wrecker and all that. Well, she didn't want to get married. She specifically did not, at least certainly not yet, because she wanted to follow this dream, this loving thing about flying.
About flying, yeah.
But he and his wife did divorce, and she eventually married him. And it was a pretty good marriage, I think, and of course, business-wise, or I should say, occupation-wise, it was a good one, because they supported each other well on that. In the meantime, she formed a connection with Purdue University. And at Purdue, she was interested in giving courses, in flying, of course, and she was very much for bringing other women up in the world. She was not a person who would get to the top, you know, in her own field and then say, the heck with everybody else.
Right, right.
She was one wanting to do that. So after their final big stunt, she was going to be doing courses at Purdue and, you know, a number of other things for research. She got interested in that, I guess, from her medical bent and from setting this record in the helicopter. So she planned to go back. She had a lot of plans. In fact, this is kind of her month. She was born on the 24th of July, and she disappeared on the 2nd of July later on, just weeks before her 40th birthday. So she'd done a lot in those years. But she and GP decided round the world. And this wasn't going to be an old tame round the world like Wiley Post or somebody, you know, who went way to the north. And as you probably recall, the circumference of the globe, the equator, is about 25,000 miles. But the farther you go away in either direction, the shorter it gets, of course, the circle. So she was going to stick as close to the equator as possible. And the route they finally had to choose, because of the availability of landing fields, ability to store fuel, availability of mechanics to look the machine over each time. Because of that, her plan, now perhaps we could see, I believe it's the first picture, it says map and it looks all green and nice. If we could see that, please. This doesn't quite show the whole globe, and you remember this projection, the north looks too big for what it really is. But you can see where the equator nips through there in the middle. She took off from the west coast of California, and the original plan was to go to Honolulu, and from Honolulu to Howland Island, and around in that direction. And it's too bad that it didn't come to pass. But when they landed in Hawaii, there was a structural failure, and the plane nosed over on the runway, and after a fine landing. But so all they could do was ship it back by sea to Lockheed and have it repaired. You know, there was no picking up another plane there or anything.
Right.
Because she had graduated to this Electra a few years past. The Electra, these two were not to scale, but the Electra was considerably larger. It was a passenger aircraft. You can see it had the windows there on the passenger compartment. You had the two vertical stabilizers, Constellation had later. And when it was on the ground, of course, it sat there like it did a rakish angle. And then when it flew, it went like this. But this was the plane she flew in. So she spent a lot of time in this little constricted cabin at the front. When she made her big trip here, this final one, the whole passenger compartment was cleaned out, and it was nothing but drums of fuel, which of course were terribly heavy, and that's part of some of the difficulties. Maybe I'll prop that, see if that'll prop. Yeah. So they had taken off, planned in accordance with their plan. They had to break it off in Honolulu, and some months later, 3 or 4 months later, they were going to do a test run across the United States. And when they got to Miami, they sort of said, maybe we should just keep going and go around, because they had all their space stations set with their fuel, everything was lined up, and they did. Now, this might be a good point. I made a list of all the things that went wrong with that flight that resulted in her death. This list, I'm going to look at it so that I don't by any chance leave anything out. Now, the original start then was changed. That was one thing, and it was a shame, because if they had gone from California to Honolulu, then Honolulu to Howland, they wouldn't have missed Howland, because a faulty chart was part of their problem. So that was one thing. Now, they were going to have more, they were going to have 2 or 3 others aboard. At least they were going to have them aboard to Honolulu. But they had to give that up because these people, their schedules would not allow them to make this change in timing. She had noticed on 1 or 2 of her earlier flights that her airplane tended to want to sort of pull to the left. And she had always had everything checked, naturally, because she was a careful pilot, a good pilot. She had everything checked, and they said nothing is wrong. And her instruments registered okay, but it was still towing a little bit to the left. And she was to notice that again once on the flight. But she took care of things like that. That, I think, was a factor in the final disaster. When they got to their final stop, piece of bad luck was her navigator, who was known to have a drinking problem, but he had it under control, apparently, and he did not. They were, both of them, dead tired. You can imagine. Could we see that map again, please? They had flown from the West Coast to Miami, and then they had nipped down to San Juan, Puerto Rico, and they bounced along the northern coast of South America there. They had, I think, 3 stops there. And then they had to cross, they had gotten below the equator, of course, but then they had to do a slanting trajectory across back up north to Saint Louis, which is near Dakar in Africa. They had gone all across Africa, Goa, you know, these little different stops. And this, just show you Arabia, but they had to get, they could not get permission to fly over Arabia, but they did get permission to fly along the coast. Flew along the coast, and they went to Karachi. That was a record for that flight, the first person to do it, to Karachi. And you can see India sticking down there now as the map resumes on the left. So they were just to the left there. Then they had to cross India and go Calcutta, Rangoon, and they were finally wound up down in Indonesia. And you can imagine how tired they must have been.
Oh, yeah. Constant
change of the timing, really inability to actually sleep very well, and under the gun all the time, focusing. So they were tired. But when they got to their final takeoff point, which it's kind of small looking on this map, but it was above Australia anyway there, he went on a bender the night before they were to take off. And of course she was tired too. They postponed their takeoff date 1 day to allow for that. And again, there might not have been a headwind. Who knows what might not have been bad about it. But they did put it off anyway. Communications were weird because you had to, your radio, sometimes as much as 2 hours, or 3 or 4 hours, I think. But it had to go to the governor of American Samoa, some of these radio transmissions. So when they finally got to take off, now they had a rubber boat aboard, and those things are pretty heavy, I guess. They scrapped it. They said, we haven't had any trouble, and you know, whatever the reason for the weight. Then they had 2 radio antennas, and this was another sore subject because she had announced that neither she nor Fred knew Morse code. So do not send us anything in Morse code because we can't read it. That was a problem there. And then just some of the channels weren't coming through strong enough, some weren't coming through right. The whole thing, there are great details, and there's this book by a couple named Long that go into all these details, which we needn't go into here, even if I could tell you each one. But the radio communications were bad from the start, and she had particularly requested a good direction finder, so that when they got near Howland, they could be, honed in. And the Coast Guard said fine. It was a Coast Guard ship that was the one monitoring. They had 3 or 4 placed along the way. But the important one at Howland was this Coast Guard one, and they had requested it and gotten the equipment. And the Navy said, well, we'll give you a good operator, experienced operator in this equipment, so that nothing can go wrong. Captain, her name was Thompson, I think, the Coast Guard man said, don't bother, we have perfectly good radio men. And that turned out to be a problem as well. These guard ships, they called them, were placed along the way. The international date line runs through sort of in the middle between New Guinea and Hawaii. And that could have caused serious problems, because it would be one day, people on the other side of the date line would be the day before. But as it happened, that didn't, because she had a communications plan, just to give you one of these details. She said, I will transmit, voice transmission, always on 15 minutes past the hour, and then I will sign off, to save power. But you transmit back to me then on the 3/4, on the 15 minutes before the hour. So it wouldn't have mattered which hour it was. But the Coast Guard radio people were answering immediately when she transmitted. Because of course she didn't hear it.
Yeah, right.
She wasn't tuned in. Things like that were just so terribly frustrating. I think maybe another one of the key things was that the Navy chart that they were using was 6 degrees off. It doesn't sound like a lot, but in terms of on the ground, it was a lot. And particularly down near the equator, where a degree was bigger than a degree anywhere else. They knew it in Washington. They had informed Hawaii, or Naval Command in Hawaii. The Itasca, the Coast Guard ship, had been informed. But she was never informed, or Fred. So they were operating 6 degrees behind the times. They thought they should be over it when they actually were a considerable distance away. And they started flying this pattern where you fly north and south of it, figuring you must intersect it if you're just a little bit off. Not realizing, of course, I think that were flying about 12,000 feet at that point. And these people did the calculations. It would be the island would have been just out of your field of vision from there, no matter how much you flew up and down. So here she is, sending her transmissions, doing the best she can with it, trying to shepherd the fuel, and never really getting the word. The direction finder, the Navy people at, Coast Guard, the Itasca, stationed off Howland Island. I think they must have had a little installation ashore. But the night before she was expected, they left it on, the radio man left it on, and the battery was dead in the morning, so they couldn't use that for direction finding. And nobody thought that there were other batteries aboard the ship. We'll quick get them. So they couldn't be honed in on this radio beam. But as her transmissions got stronger or weaker, they could tell she was closer or farther away, so they knew she was there. And a sample of some of the seriousness, or lack thereof, that some of these people took, and some of the crew on the Itasca called her a goony dame. They said, this goony dame, she's coming in late. Women are always like, goony dame coming in late. And it's ruining our morale. We just have to sit here and play cards all day, waiting for her to come. Now, they all weren't like that, of course. But if everybody had really been on their toes and been taking it seriously, it might have been a little different. Well, so you all know the end result. The end result was that the transmissions stopped, and there was no indication of where they were or what had happened to them. They were simply not there. And the various theories of it, there were a couple of outlandish ones. One that she was really working for the American government.
Yes, I heard
the
that
spy
one.
theory, that she was checking to see what the Japanese were doing out there and all that. And that she crashed, or they shot her down, and they interrogated her and eventually killed her. And either Fred had the same fate or he was killed in the shooting. You know, wild stuff. Another one said that she'd been a spy and she got back and lived out the rest of her life incognito in New Jersey. As a housewife in New Jersey. The two that hold the most water, really, are one that she crashed on this island of Nikomororo, which is more like a circle than an island, and with the coral reefs all around it and a big lagoon in the middle. These expeditions, they've had 5 or 6 from this one organization called Tiger, or TIGHAR, the International Group for Historic Aircraft Restoration, or Finding, or whatever. They've gone out there a few times, and they found things, and they've said, well, this proves that this is where they were. I don't think it does. The things, they found the heel of a lady's shoe, for example. You know, if you have a shoe rehealed, and they said, well, this was for the kind of shoe that she inclined to wear. Somebody found the remains of an opaque glass jar and said, oh, she had freckles and she didn't like them, and so she always carried freckle cream, you know, or skin cream about it. Well, they found a number. They also found bones, which were interpreted, one as a man, North European man, another as a small North European woman. Well, she was pretty good height, you know, she wasn't all that tiny. In the meantime, in 1939, 2 years after the disappearance, a colony had been founded there. Some of the people from the Pacific Islands, they were getting a little overcrowded. Somebody had the idea to form a colony here to grow coconut trees and for the hemp. And it existed there from 1939 or 40 until 1963. People lived there, you know, and dug gardens and built fires and did things. And one would be pretty sure they would have found something a little more telling. But the latest thing they found, and they're out there right now, they're staying for 24 days, and the dates were given as June, July this year. They found something, they saw something underwater at the foot of a small cliff underwater that they said, look at the fuselage of an airplane. And they thought maybe it could be this part of an airplane at the back here, because no windows or anything. They found also a piece of aluminum that was just the right size to cover these windows. And the windows were, of course, pasted over with aluminum caps when they weren't using it as a passenger plane. So these things hold a certain amount of weight, but the theory that I think carries much more weight is that they went down, not way to the south. See, this island is 350 miles south of Howland Island. If they could even have got there with their fuel, it would be surprising. But up to the northwest, now if they had been flying, you know, this up and down, hoping to intersect their target, and Fred was a good navigator. Drink he did, but he was sober, maybe a little hungover, but he was sober all this time. Very sober, I imagine, as the fuel ran out. But they were able to do it. In 1973 was when they first started, and another officer, Navy or Coast Guard, Navy I think, is into the bathysphere field, and these were these little, at the time, just kind of round balls. Yes, there's a picture of Howland Island up there, by the way. That was their target in that vast Pacific. Well, this bathysphere determined that down at the bottom was perfectly level. And there were no volcanoes or anything upwind that could have covered it. It's 17,000 feet down over that. So it's upwards of 3 miles.
We're down to the last minute. So.
Oh! Well, it's upwards of 3 miles down, but perfectly level, and there would not have been heavy sedimentation. And that we have a picture of an airplane, Navy plane, yes, that spent 26 years underwater in an area that was similarly free of things. It had hardly more than a light dusting of sand on top of it, sediment on top of it. So my money is on that theory. And I wish to goodness that they could mount another one of these things and get down to 17,000 feet. But these other people have more money, and if you pay $50,000, you could go on the expedition. And they had, I think they used a cruise ship. And you could pay all this money and you could go along.
Sure.
But the upshot of it is that it's really a tragedy, because so many things, if 2 or 3 of the most important ones of those had not been as they were, things would have probably not happened the way they did. Mm-hmm. They also disregarded ham radio things that had some radio calls after the official ones. So for my money, that airplane is sitting down 17,000 plus feet below the Pacific Northwest of Howland Island, and if they can drum up some interest in that, it's not as crowd pleasing as little opaque jars of freckle cream, you know, and bones. But she was really a nice person, a good person.
She was a fascinating person,
yeah.
and way ahead of her time so far as what she was doing. Yes.
So the world is missing something.
Yes.
In helping women get into
but
science.
I think she probably opened the door for a lot of,
I hope so.
Of women. Yes.
And who knows what she might have found in medical research.
That's right. That's right.
But,
okay.
Hurrah for